In this chapter, we're going to talk about discrimination. Discrimination along racial lines, along gender lines, and w- more specifically, the economist's interpretation of that, both in terms of understanding different economic outcomes, but how that emerges. So, the the largest kind of the largest achievement, I guess, of women in the United States is the dramatically higher labor force participation rate that they've had um, since really the 1960s. Um, in fact, if we were to try to look at this, you would see here that really, again, since the 1960s, it's grown from, let's say, a third to almost 60%. And we can compare that to, or add that um, for men. And we see quite the opposite, right? From a high amount down, so that yeah, there's a distinct difference between the two, but that difference has narrowed quite a bit. Um, so, despite the fact, though, that more women are participating in the labor force, the problem remains is that men do earn more income than women, that men are not only earning more income, but then their wages per hour are higher, and consequently, they're less likely to be in poverty. Um, and when a woman is single, their chances of declaring bankruptcy rise dramatically. Now, what does that why is that? Is it just that the labor force dislikes males or dislikes females? Not really. I mean, again, I'm a male, so my understanding at least is a little bit limited. And to be honest, my wife earns more than me, and I have um, absolutely no problem with that. Um, Having said that, and I hear, you know, my wife is, she works. She doesn't have like a boss, that oversees her or anything like that. She is her boss. Um, so she doesn't really experience it that way, but sometimes she does. She refers to kind of the subtle ways, the comments that sort of diminish what she contributes in the workplace, and um, that's present. I don't doubt that that's present, but I think there's a deeper richness to why, in understanding why it's so much less income and wages that are being earned by women. What would those reasons be? Well, one of the things that we will learn is that it's a lot of it is unfortunately the um, unfair distribution of work within the home, namely raising children, that causes a good deal of that problem. So, if we look at the differences between men and women, um, we see exactly this, right? That women are in a dramatically worse economic shape than men across all measures. Okay. Um, this isn't unique to the United States. This is really something that is seen around the world. Um, and that difference between women and men's um, income um, is that women have only been able to recently get slightly over 80%, be paid 80 cents on the dollar um, for what men are doing. Now, is it the case that a woman doing the same job as a man is actually paid 20% less? Not precisely. Eh, Largely because of various laws, companies are going to be so explicit about it. Um, but what you do see is that women are put into different kinds of positions within the firm that cause their income to be lower, or they just don't progress within the firm fast enough to be able to capture even higher wages, right? Because they're taking time off to take care of family members or take care of children, etc. And this isn't unique to low paying jobs. We see this in other positions as well. Um, and it should be noted too that part of the problem of what's being experienced is that women tend to congregate in what is called kind of pink jobs or pink professions like preschool teacher or um, preschool teacher, nurse, um, caretakers, basically, which generally have paid less than a male's position. And that difference between men and women spread crosses over to racial lines as well. Um, it is absolutely the case that the economic position of African Americans has increased, but there still are persistent differences. Um, Again, not necessarily discrimination, but that there is a difference, again, caused by a richness of reasons why. Here, the reasons are different than they are for women versus men. For women versus men, it's really kind of a large part of it can be understood as the differences between undertaking responsibilities at home, caretaking, congregation around certain positions. Um, for African Americans, it goes back to um, availability of credit to be able to get a higher education, um, availability of transportation, childcare, the vicious cycle of poverty persisting. Um, and what you see is that between men and women, that difference has grown larger, and that especially for whites and African Americans, that difference has become larger, and you'll notice that the slope of the red line is actually steeper than it is for the black line, meaning that really the past 3 decades of economic progress, those benefits have accrued more to Caucasians than they have African Americans. um, let's just get to some of the reasons why here. So again, what is the reason for this? Um, Again, I'm a white male, so it's I don't want to take my experience and try to generalize it and say, hey, there's no problems here. But um, again, the idea of seeing persistent disparate treatment discrimination is a bit more rare. It's a bit more rare, not because people aren't doing it, but because in some cases they're just hiding it better. And the reason why they're hiding it better is because they know um, that there are pretty strict laws out there that remove disparate treatment discrimination. Um, the adverse impact discrimination. So this is when um, something that's being done necessarily affects one group more than another. Um, so this would be something like, well, COVID was a perfect example. It hurt women particularly more because if they're in this caretaker position and you've got a health pandemic where the burden's going to fall more on women, um, if a firm doesn't offer good leave policies or childcare policies, that's going to affect women than more than it will men. And then you've got rational or statistical discrimination. This is the kind of discrimination that's um, largely follows the line of a firm just trying to maximize its profit, and again, affecting some groups more than others. I would argue that my sense of the reality is that yes, there is some disparate treatment discrimination, but people hide it pretty well. So it's a little unclear about how persistent it is. Um, to be honest, I mean, I'm not, I'm when I make these lectures, I'm just kind of speaking, kind of truthfully from my experiences. I mean, if anything, I mean, I guess I experience it as a um, minority in Hawaii, right? I mean, just in terms of opportunities that um, others have rather than me. But don't get me wrong, I'm not looking for the opportunities. Um, but I'm just saying, like, if I were younger and less advanced in my profession, um, it might bother me a bit more. So I don't doubt that there's disparate treatment discrimination out there, but most of it is the adverse impact discrimination. Policies that a firm implements that are designed by a manager or supervisor based on their notion of the world, but because they tend to be, let's say, a male or a Caucasian, um, it makes sense to them, but to certain employees who are not a male or a Caucasian, it may not help them and it may hurt that person. It's not necessarily discriminatory, it's just kind of um, ignorant, I guess, is the best way to put it. Ignorant of um, what um, of what could actually help people. Now, how would you find out that discrimination exists? Well, the one thing you could do, which isn't very easy, but the one thing you could do is you could employ some regression techniques. So, what the regression technique would involve is you looking at um, income levels or income levels on the left side of the equation. And on the right side of the equation, you would have the series of variables that determine what that wage is. And one of those categories would be whether the person was Caucasian or African American, and how much more income does someone who is white get than non white. To be able to do regression techniques to detect discrimination, you typically need a very large data set. So you don't see this being used too much. Um, and then auditing techniques, I don't know. I don't really see it that much in reality. usually you see that kind of like on TV, I guess. Or a firm might say they might do it. Um, you know, I don't know. I mean, I just it's um, auditing techniques. You see this done by very large firms that are sophisticated and care quite a bit about it. But I imagine most firms, since they're not required to do any sort of auditing techniques to detect discrimination, most of them don't bother. Now, the economist's notion of any of this discrimination is we don't need to worry about it. Not that it doesn't have an impact, but that the market will solve discrimination. Remember, economists love markets. So markets are the kind of um, thing that will eliminate discrimination. So the idea here is, let's say I own a business. Let's say I own a restaurant, and in that restaurant, um, I like to hire white females as my, like, let's say, greeter, right? The person at the front desk that you know you know gets reservations and puts people at their table. And let's say if a man wants that job and he's very qualified for that job, I don't pay him as much because you know he can't, let's say, appeal to my customers in the same way um, that a female could, right? Again, I'm playing the role here of the discriminatory restaurant owner. What the economist would say is, oh, you can do one of two things. You could tell Scheiding it's against the law to do that. Don't do that, and we're gonna like pass a bunch of laws and enforce the fact that you shouldn't do that. That would be one option, and we do see that being one of the primary ways that we try to control for that. Or we could just say, you know what, Scheiding's got a taste for having women greeters, and he's not going to hire well qualified male greeters, and that's his thing. But his business is going to suffer because he's hiring these greeters without any consideration of their skill sets. He's just hiring because they're females, and my business is going to make less profits compared to the other restaurant next door to me that takes employees based on their quality of care, based on how good of an employee they are. And eventually I'll go out of business. Me, the discriminatory restaurant. So competition would solve the problem here, at least according to the economist. Now, it may not happen, right? So in theory, we could think it's going to happen. But one of the problems would be is that not only could I, as a um, business, be discriminatory as a business owner, but unfortunately, we live in a world where the customers are um, discriminatory as well. And it's hard to, like, you can't force people to behave the right way, right? So you can get where I'm going with this, right? So if I run this restaurant then that hires only female greeters, you can get a good sense of what my typical customer is going to be, right? And they're going to be dropping down the money to go, to my restaurant to see this greeter. And so my profits are going to go away, right? Whereas the very well qualified male greeter at the neighboring restaurant, he's going to get like the um, lower paying customers potentially. So it may not happen. Um, the other side of this, right, is that um, firms that um, discriminate um, may not um, go out of business because the structure of the entire industry is discriminatory. So you may not even find a neighboring restaurant then that hires a male greeter or a male waiter or anything like that. It may be just a historical fact that most of the greeters have always been um, females. Now, if we look again deeper at the causes of why this is the case, this is the primary reason. Um, and I don't um, there's not a lot I can really say about it, except it's unfair. Um, I mean, I can, to make it again a personal part. I mean, even when my wife was having our first child, um, and my wife was taking over the business from someone else. I mean, I know that the other person was unhappy about the fact that she was going to be needing some time off. And, obviously it reduces the amount of time that she feels she's able to take time off um, for having a child. But that even if she does take the time off, right, then the person loses contact with the rest of the firm, advancement opportunities, and then once they come back to the firm, it takes them a long time to kind of catch up. And so those absences, because again, what if you don't have just one child, right? Now my wife has had three children. It doesn't get easier as time goes on. The law provides that your job will still be there for you. But even paid time leave isn't a given for something like pregnancy. Your job is guaranteed, but it's up to the individual states and the individual employer to offer it. Hawaii, for instance, my state employment, there is no paid family leave, right? For now, it affects both men and women. I've had two children born during the academic year, one born during the summer. Summer was easy, right? I'm off anyway, and that was easy. But for the ones, I had one born in February and one born in April. Dude, like in the February of not in the same year, obviously, but in the February of a year and the April of a year, it just sucks. Like, and this is just me as the male, right? Like, this is me, trying to be supportive as a spouse and trying to handle all my classes at the same time. And I can't, if I had paid family leave, I would take it, but I don't. And so it's harder to have that loss in income and just know that the job is going to be there for you. That's me as a male, right? I don't even want to pretend to think that I can, can talk to you with any um, authority about what it is then for the woman state employee who faces that same problem. Um, and then it's all about going back to work. Um, you know, the tendency, obviously, when you have children, is that you want to do right by them, and um, and children require a lot of work, so you may be tempted to stay at home to take care of them. And women would fulfill that role more than men tend to. So that would mean then that they might be out of the labor force for up to 5 years until the child enters kindergarten. But also, as I said too, women tend to congregate again in the pink professions: teachers, nurses, secretaries, um, social workers. And these are five professions, which, if you eyeball them, they may not make a lot of money. And then the final part of this, and COVID has certainly emphasized this a lot, is that women tend to prefer industries and jobs that have flexible employment, but it's those same jobs then that don't pay as much. So that would be, like owning a shop on Etsy, let's say. Nothing wrong with that. It's a perfectly fine way to make some money. At the same time, you know, um, you're not going to make a lot of money doing that. Okay. Um, so why is that? Right. Part of it, right? We may see it in terms of sociology or even biology. And I'm actually, I think about these things as well. I have my the first two children of mine um, were boys, and now I have a girl, and I think about these things. Um, for her, not that I didn't think about them before, but um, it is. I don't know how else to say it. And again, I'm a white male, but I, I don't know how to describe it except to say that it is a different lived experience, right? Between a mother and her child, and a father and his child, um, and I would argue a woman's relationship to work and her child, and a man's relationship to work and her child. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong, or that it's not biologically determined, socially determined by the society, the government, the church, the rest of your family members. All of that's going into it. All I can say is that the consequence of it is typically that women congregate to professions that allow them to take care of their children. So they demand professions where taking care of their children is not seen as a detriment or an obstacle, such as being a professor. We're not even technically, I think, allowed to bring children to campus, right? Whereas if I were, I don't know, a grade school teacher, dude, my kid's going to the same school I go to then, right? And so it's a little bit different. And again, there you got that socialization process as well. Now, the discrimination as well, um, part of it um, can go into a market that tends to act discriminatory. And that would be, for instance, what used to be called redlining, where African Americans wouldn't be shown homes, for instance, in certain neighborhoods, um, that African Americans have more difficult access to mortgages, but also that African Americans have more um, difficulty obtaining reliable transportation. Now, all this led um, to try to right these wrongs, to having some affirmative action policies. And that's kind of where um, this chapter ends. Um, think when we think of affirmative action, we're trying to basically think of a world where um, we try to equalize. Um, they're trying to equalize access to opportunities, and so um, this notion of affirmative action dates back to the 1960s, and it dates back to the time of Lyndon Johnson. Again, a name that's been coming up quite often here. Um, that even as you can kind of see in this quote here, at Howard University, an HBCU, a historically black university. Um, in this case, Johnson's basically saying, now that African Americans have more freedoms, you can't just say, "Now figure it out." Um, to allow there to be fair competition, um, you've got to try to equalize things, right? So um, you can do that in several ways. Affirmative action wouldn't be just to say you have to have a certain number of whites, a certain number of women, a certain number of men, a certain number of African Americans. Not necessarily that. It really could be just saying, um, how do we give the same opportunities to those different groups? And so, even from the Republicans, so even under the Nixon administration, you see that affirmative action being present in the federal government um, contracts. You see contracts going to these minority owned contractors. Um, but affirmative action has had some kind of legal setbacks in the Supreme Court. And what those affirmative action is looked at, um, that's questioned by the courts, the Supreme Courts, in terms of it kind of being reverse discrimination. So, affirmative action, think of it more as existing along a scale. And so, if it exists along a scale, what you can do is you can think of it as, um, the way that I don't know, how would I say that it exists for Hawaii state employment? I would say it's equal opportunity to apply. I guess I would see that. Um, Everything else, and race is the tiebreaker. I'd say those are the two that I've seen most in Hawaii. Um, the, I mean, in some sense, and again, this is just me freely talking about it. I guess the only way I've kind of experienced it is, as a white male in Hawaii, and my wife um, being from here, um, that I don't know how else to. I mean, in some sense, me even getting my job here was aided by the fact that I could talk about her. You're trying to use her race as my bridge to kind of um, to get this job, and her being from here, having family here, um, helped me get this job. Um, I don't think it was the only thing that helped me get the job, but I do think it acted as a tiebreaker of sorts, between um, other individuals that were applying for the job. Now, those things are fine. Equal opportunity to apply, that's certainly legal. Race is a tiebreaker, certainly legal. Then you start to get into legal trouble or legal questions. If you start to impose things like quotas are generally considered illegal. You then also have even things like guidelines where you set, internal targets for meeting certain hiring and promotion standards for minorities. Those could get you in court as well, as being reverse discriminatory. And you see this in admissions, um, where obviously you indicate what your race is, and that can um, get you into certain schools that typically don't have a lot of that race. Um, And generally speaking, it's been at least for graduate, for undergraduate and graduate admissions. Generally, the courts have permitted it, so it's been done. Okay. Um, I'm not going. And there's not much more. The myths are certainly um, there. I'll let you kind of read them and think about them. But in general, I don't want to end this chapter on a negative note. We've absolutely made progress as a society um, in reducing discrimination, but we can't really um, pat ourselves on the back too much because there is persistency in the discrimination that exists, and that should trouble us because despite all we've done to reduce discrimination, both along gender lines and racial lines, it is still there. And it becomes a little bit more difficult to understand um, how it could be reduced.